The energy giant Shell makes its second biggest quarterly profit on record. High oil and gas prices and the war in Ukraine led to profits more than doubling on the same period last year.
Families will find this obscene. They're really struggling. They're considering, how do we turn off the heating? How do we keep a roof over our children's head and food on the tables this winter?
We'll get the latest reaction to today's figures and find out what it might mean for windfall taxes. Also this lunchtime, politicians in Northern Ireland have until midnight to restore the power-sharing executive or face new elections. The death of Mi Kuen Chong, whose body was dumped in Devon, her friend is found guilty of her murder. An NHS strike ballot begins as Unison nurses, paramedics and hospital porters in England, Wales and Northern Ireland vote in a dispute over pay. And the annual Poppy Appeal is launched by the Royal British Legion in the run-up to Armistice Day.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, Ian Poulter responds to Rory McIlroy's recent criticism, saying he hasn't betrayed anyone by being involved with the Live Golf Series.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The energy giant Shell has revealed a huge upswing in profits, making £8.2 billion between July and September. That is more than double what it made in the same period last year, although it is a slowdown from the second quarter of this year when it announced record figures. High oil and gas prices and the war in Ukraine have all fed into the increase. The figures have prompted calls for the tax on energy firms' profits to be raised to help people with bills. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but first, this report is from our business correspondent, Mark Ashdown.
Our energy pain is Shell's gain. While we've all been feeling the effects of rocketing wholesale gas and oil prices in our energy bills and at the petrol pumps, companies like Shell have enjoyed bumper profits.
It's beyond ridiculous. Something has to be done with Shell just raking in huge money.
Tax should be much fairer amongst the businesses. They should be paying more than they are. It's worldwide, not just here in Britain.
It feels like a windfall tax would be a good thing, if I'm completely honest. These are profits that they weren't expecting.
Between July and September, Shell's underlying profit was £8.2 billion. That compares to just £3.6 billion in the same period last year. So far this year, the energy giant has made £26 billion.
Families will find this obscene. They're really struggling. They're considering, how do we turn off the heating? How do we keep a roof over our children's head and food on the tables this winter? And that's why the government has to act. No more excuses. Impose a higher windfall tax.
When he was Chancellor, Rishi Sunak introduced a 25% extra windfall tax on extraordinary profits, on top of the 40% tax oil and gas companies already pay on their UK operations. But some say these profits are so excessive that further taxes are now justified.
As this government scrambles to find ways to deal with the cost of living crisis, it should be blindingly obvious that oil and gas companies like Shell are sitting on an untapped gold mine.
Now, it's worth pointing out these companies don't always make this kind of money. There are plenty of lean periods too, and wholesale prices have already come way down from their highs this year. Now, Shell's also planning to invest up to £25 billion over the next 10 years in the UK, mainly in low or zero carbon energy, and some fear more taxes could jeopardise that.
Actually, a very cleverly designed windfall tax may help the government to achieve certain targets. But the danger is that somebody else may design a poor windfall tax, and that would create actually a distortion to investment, and investment may not happen, or it will go elsewhere where it is more attractive to do so.
A report today by the International Energy Agency suggests the global energy crisis could be a turning point towards a cleaner, more sustainable future. For now, the debate goes on over what should happen to energy firms' eye-watering profits. Mark Ashdown, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our business editor, Simon Jack, and we heard it there. In some quarters, calls for further taxes on these energy profits.
When you make £26 billion in the first 9 months of the year, it is totally understandable that people are clamouring out at a time of cost of living crisis to tax them more highly. 3 things to point out, though. 90% or more of Shell's profits are made outside the UK. They are taxed by other jurisdictions. Very hard to double tax them on the profits they're making in the US or Indonesia or elsewhere. Second, they're already paying 65% on any profits they make in the UK. So what's the right number? 70? 100? And as Mark said in his piece, they've also committed spending 20 to 25 billion pounds over the next decade here in the UK, mainly on renewables or low carbon energy. If you get to something like 90 or 100%, you've got to wonder whether all of that would actually happen. So very tempting to see the target on these companies' backs. But it's very, it's tempting to see simple solutions to what are sometimes complex problems.
And it is not only energy firms that are making big profits.
No, banks are making big profits as well on the main, because as interest rates go up, as we've seen, the difference between what banks pay their depositors, their savers, and what they charge their borrowers, that's the interest margin, grows as interest rates rise, and so they should be making big bucks, and some of them are. However, as those interest rates rise, so does the chance that people won't be able to pay back some of those debts. And we saw from Lloyds, the biggest bank in the UK today, saying they're putting £700 million aside for bad debts. The other thing they said is that their base case is that house prices would fall 8% next year. In the worst case scenario, 18% next year. So between 10 and 20% roughly. Biggest mortgage lender in the UK, a very gloomy outlook for the UK economy.
Simon, thank you for now. Simon Jack. Politicians in Northern Ireland have until midnight to restore the power-sharing executive or face new elections. The Assembly hasn't been sitting because of the refusal of the Democratic Unionist Party to elect a Speaker or a Deputy First Minister because of their dislike of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the trading arrangement negotiated during Brexit, which has been a source of tension since it came into effect last year. If a Speaker isn't elected by tonight's deadline, then the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, says a fresh Assembly election will be called. Our correspondent Charlotte Gallagher is at Stormont this lunchtime. Charlotte.
A pre-Christmas election very much on the cards here, Jane. Politicians meeting in the building behind me now, trying to get back together, trying to get back to work. But it looks really unlikely. Still, these huge blocks in the Democratic Unionist Party saying they're not going back until the protocol is axed or significantly altered. The only certainty in Northern Ireland politics at the moment is more uncertainty. Belfast's busy city centre. Shoppers, workers, tourists. But 4 miles away, a parliament shut for business for months. Today, politicians are back. One last-ditch attempt to get Stormont back up and running. Sinn Féin's vice president taking aim at the Democratic Unionist Party and its leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
He stood for election, yet failed to show up. This is his mess and a failure of leadership by him and his party.
Power sharing, if it is to mean anything, has to be about consensus and consent, not contempt, which is what we on these benches have been subjected to on every occasion that the recall of this Assembly has taken place over the past 6 months.
So how did we get to this stalemate? Politics here is based on 1998's the Good Friday Agreement. It brought an end to the Troubles and enshrined that nationalists and unionists must share power.
This is the choice that humanity has to make in every age, between the daring that crosses new frontiers and allows us to make progress, or the timidity that shuts itself away in seclusion where we stagnate.
But now the Democratic Unionist Party and its leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, have walked out and are refusing to return until the Northern Ireland Protocol and the post-Brexit trading arrangements are gone or significantly altered. It's almost certain that an election will be called, as the deadline to get power sharing back is 1 minute past midnight tomorrow. But what do voters think?
People need to start working in Stormont. I think people need to actually get in there and do the job and actually make decisions rather than just, I think people have made it clear what way they want.
I reckon it's a bad thing at during an election. because nobody seems to be doing anything about it. It's a waste of time.
What's it gonna do? Do you know what I mean? I just think them people are going to be in no matter what, so our votes aren't even counting. You know what I mean? I just think it's just the way it is.
If it instills positive change, I'm open for voting again.
The last Assembly election was historic. Sinn Féin, the largest party for the first time ever. Another election will cost around £6.5 million and may solve nothing. In a cost of living crisis, is this what people in Northern Ireland want? Some people are really concerned about the Northern Ireland Protocol and its impact, but many more are concerned about paying their mortgage, paying their heating bills, buying food. And you know what, Jane? I would be really worried if I was a politician here in Northern Ireland and was going to have to knock on people's doors before an election, before Christmas. There's lots of people here that are just fed up with politics.
Charlotte Gallagher, thank you there at Stormont. A woman has been found guilty of murdering and decapitating a friend in an attempt to inherit her estate. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell killed Mi Quen Chong in London in June last year before putting her body in a suitcase and dumping it 200 miles away in Devon. Our correspondent Anjana Gadgil is at the Old Bailey. Explain more, first of all, about what's happened in court today, Anjana.
Well, Jane, as you said, Gemma Mitchell and Mi Quen Chong were friends. They met through church in 2020, but a row over money led Gemma Mitchell to kill the older woman in June of last year. And the police have released CCTV, which shows the defendant coming from the direction of the victim's house. She's pulling a blue suitcase, which the prosecution say has the victim's body inside, having committed the murder. She hired a taxi under a false name to transport it to her house. And the prosecution believe, in all probability, she kept it in her garden for up to 2 weeks before hiring a car and driving it 200 miles to Devon. 16 days after she was reported missing, Miss Chong's headless body was found in woods in the resort of Salcombe by a family on holiday. Mitchell had forged Miss Chong's will so that she and her mother would receive her estate. The court heard that she needed money to pay for repairs at her home in northwest London. In fact, Miss Chong had offered £200,000 to pay for those renovations before changing her mind. Shortly after she changed her mind, she disappeared.
And what more do we know about Gemma Mitchell?
She'd worked as an osteopath, she had a degree in human sciences, and she had the skills, the jury heard, to dismember a body. There was no forensic evidence linking Miss Mitchell to the crime. All the evidence was circumstantial. She declined to give evidence in court, and in her police interviews in custody, she answered no comment. Detective Chief Inspector Jim Eastwood described her as a ruthless killer, saying the cold facts of the case were shocking. The jury took just over 8 hours to reach their verdict, and Gemma Mitchell will be sentenced tomorrow.
And Anjana Gadgil, thank you, at the Old Bailey. Well, the number of crimes that result in someone being charged is now half what it was 7 years ago. Figures released today show that the proportion of crimes reported to police that result in a charge has fallen from just over 15% in March 2015 to just over 5%. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Samford is with me. Such low figures, Daniel.
Yeah, it should have been quite a mixed picture on crime today. The crime survey, which measures people's experience of crime, actually suggests crime's down since the pandemic, but there's some quite worrying rises, particularly in the number of sexual crimes being reported. But we're focusing today on what we call crime outcomes, what the outcome is of a crime that's been reported to police. So we've been tracking that for quite a long time. If we look back at March 2015, 7 years ago, we'll see that there are around 3.5 million offences recorded by the police, of which 15.5% resulted in a charge. Now, you might not think that's a brilliant set of figures, but look what happens next. In the latest set of figures, up to June 2022, there were 5.4 million crimes recorded, but only 5.4% resulted in a charge. You might think, oh, well, because the numbers of crimes being recorded has gone up, does that maybe mean there's something going on there? No, the actual physical number of offences which result in a charge has dropped from about 600,000 to about 300,000. And it's not clear really why that's going on. The largest number of offences reported to the police end up in either the victim saying they don't want any further action or the police saying that they didn't identify a suspect. One of those has gone down, the other's gone up, but that's where the largest number remains. But it's still not clear why it is that the number resulting in charge is getting lower and lower and lower and lower every year. It might have had something to do with the police cuts that happened back in 2010, but of course the police officer numbers have started to rise in recent years, but still this number of offences resulting in a charge is stubbornly going down.
Daniel Sanford, thank you. It is 41 days since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in Iran after being detained by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Her death has sparked protests across Iran and around the world. The BBC's Samira Hussain has been speaking to one Iranian protester who's now in Islamabad waiting for a visa to the US. To protect him, we're concealing his identity and using only his first name.
Her death has become a symbol for a movement against the country's authoritarian regime. Moin was in his home city of Tehran when the uprising began and was in the thick of the protests.
There are protests almost every other day, and they are getting suppressed violently. And even if you're not a protester, you might get some of the shrapnels. You might get beaten up, or I know of some people who have even gotten killed.
To protect his family back in Iran, we are only using his first name and concealing his face.
There's been regular shooting at the protests. I've seen it many times. It's either with military-style bullets or with pellets. I've seen the suppression forces beating people for the sake of just beating them up.
This is the city of Saqqez, Mahsa's home and now her final resting place. Authorities tried but failed to block protesters flocking to her grave to mark the end of the mourning period, a culturally significant moment for Iranians.
That could have easily been my sister. That could have easily been my girlfriend. There's this tyranny, and it's murderous. What I'm going to do with my conscience if I sit down? Yes, I need to bear some risks, but I need to do it for the safety of my people and my friends and my parents. If I don't do it, who's gonna?
The attempts to suppress the rage and anger of Iranians are violent and deadly. But videos being shared on social media show a country full of defiance and determined for regime change. Samira Hussain, BBC News, Islamabad.
The time is 18 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. The energy giant Shell makes its second biggest quarterly profit on record. Still to come here, England captain Harry Kane talks about the inspirational Lionesses with 3 weeks to go to the Men's World Cup.
Coming up on the BBC News Channel, tennis coach Dmitry Tursunov explains why he couldn't continue working with British tennis number one Emma Raducanu, admitting there were red flags that he couldn't ignore.
The annual Poppy Appeal has been launched by the Royal British Legion in the run-up to Armistice Day on the 11th of November. And already there is a large wall in central London bristling with poppies where people are uncovering stories of armed forces personnel. Graham Satchell has this report.
See, that's all it needs to be said.
Veterans in front of a wall of poppies on the south bank of the River Thames. This, the official launch of the annual Royal British Legion Appeal. Look a little closer, and as the poppies are removed, they reveal extraordinary stories of bravery, sacrifice and heartache. Kingsman Anthony Cooper was on patrol in Afghanistan in 2010 when his life changed forever.
I remember the track I was going down, while going down it, and then a click. And that's it.
Anthony had stepped on an explosive device. He lost both his legs and his right eye.
It's very important that we remember I lost 3 really good friends in Afghanistan, so I'll be remembering them, and I'll be remembering the fallen from the past as well.
Chantel's husband Ryan was a medic in Afghanistan. His life fell apart when he came home.
Before Ryan went, he was easygoing, lovely family man, everything over his head. And then when he come back, it would come back in the November, so it was firework night, so he'd be hiding under tables, he'd be really jumpy. He used to think he was back on that war zone. And then on November the 10th, Ryan had took his own life and committed suicide. Me and my eldest daughter found him hanging in the garage.
Chantel turned to the British Legion for help. They have given her practical and emotional support. What do you think of the Royal British Legion?
They're amazing, absolutely amazing. I can't thank them enough for all the support that we've received.
Bernard Morgan signed up for the RAF on his 18th birthday. He was part of the invasion of northern France in June 1944.
We landed in the afternoon of D-Day at 6:30 p.m. and it was sad to see all the dead bodies lying on the beach, which had arrived with the morning invasion part, and they were the first dead bodies I'd ever seen, and it was a very sad sight. The younger generation must be told of what went on all these years ago, and it's also to pay tribute to the sailors, soldiers, airmen and civilians who gave their lives for the freedom that we enjoy today.
98-year-old Bernard Morgan ending that report from Graham Satchell. About 350,000 NHS staff are to start voting on whether to strike over pay. The biggest health union, Unison, is balloting its members in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They include nurses, paramedics, midwives and porters. A vote in Scotland has been suspended after the Holyrood administration made a higher pay offer. Let's talk to our health editor, Hugh Pym, who's at a hospital in London. And it's not only Unison that's involved in all of this, in potential strike action, Hugh.
Well, that's right, Jane. Unison's launched its ballot today. Earlier this week, the GMB, another health union, started balloting paramedics and other ambulance staff. And the Royal College of Nursing has already started balloting its 300,000 members around the UK. If they vote in favour of walkouts, that'll be the first of its kind in the history of the Royal College of Nursing, going back more than 100 years. Now, it's over a 4% pay award in England and Wales, £1,400 for each member of staff. That is well below inflation, but the government, speaking for England, the Department of Health, says that actually it's in line with the independent pay review body, and unions should think very, very carefully about taking action that might affect patients. The unions do say, though, that anything that they do will only be non-urgent care. I should say in Scotland, the Scottish government's made this higher offer, and Unison has postponed its ballot to ask members whether they want to accept that.
Hugh Pym, thank you. The government is failing to get a grip on how the UK's water supply, power grid and railways will be affected by extreme weather events caused by climate change. That's one of the findings of a report released today by a joint committee of MPs and peers. It says Britain's national security is being jeopardised. Here's our environment correspondent, Jonah Fisher.
This is the aftermath of Storm Arwen in November last year. MPs and peers say it's an example of how the breakdown of one critical service can quickly affect another. In this case, the high winds and snow brought power cuts, which then meant digital phone lines stopped working, leaving some with no way to call the emergency services. Our warming climate will mean more heat waves and droughts, and there will also be more intense storms and rain. The committee warns that it's likely to mean more damaged train tracks, flooded infrastructure sites, landslides and power cuts. Their call is not just for greater resilience, but for joined-up thinking in government.
What we found is that there are people who are trying to keep the phones working, say, and there are people who are trying to make sure that we have access to water. but they're not necessarily talking to each other. And there's nobody looking at the overall picture. Governments in this country are not really geared to looking at things in the round. Every department has its own expertise, its own pride, its own ethos, and they look after their own interests, and they're not necessarily looking over their shoulder to the bloke next door and saying, hang on a minute, if I do this, what effect will it have on him? And you know, it's a big weakness generally in our system of government.
Responding to the report, a spokesperson for the Cabinet Office said there are robust systems in place to protect critical national infrastructure from the effects of climate change. How bad it gets will depend on how quickly we stop emitting the greenhouse gases that warm our planet. Next month, the world will come together again, this time in Egypt, to discuss what progress, if any, has been made since the climate talks in Glasgow last year. Speaking to the BBC in New York, the United Nations top diplomat issued a stark warning.
If we are not able to reverse the present trend that is leading to a catastrophe in the world, we will be doomed. And so this must be, for all of us, an absolute priority.
Mr. Guterres said he had faith in the British people and that he was convinced that they would not allow the government to backtrack on its climate commitments. Jonah Fisher, BBC News.
The owners of a care home in Lancashire have apologised after a video was posted on social media showing members of staff dressing up and dancing in adult nappies. Century Healthcare, which runs Gillibrand Hall Nursing Home in Chorley, says it's extremely disappointed by what's happened. Mairead Smith reports.
Dancing down the corridor in adult nappies, needed by some residents here, worn by some staff, having a laugh on TikTok. A staff member rising from a reclining chair to the tune of the Westlife cover, You Raise Me Up. And an apology from Century Healthcare, who own Gillibrand Hall Nursing Home in Chorley. They say they're extremely disappointed at the actions, behaviour and posts made on social media that have subsequently been taken down. The owners say they've informed their regulator, the Care Quality Commission. The CQC told us we've been made aware of an incident at Gillibrand Hall Nursing Home in Chorley and are liaising with the provider and local authority to ensure all necessary actions are being taken to keep people safe. We've also heard from the local MP for Chorley, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. He says that he was disturbed to see the video posted and can understand why this has caused a great deal of concern and upset. He says it is paramount that everything is done to reassure residents and their families that staff treat everyone with the respect and dignity they deserve. And he's asked the CQC for their investigation into this incident to be thorough and swift. Mairead Smith, BBC News.
The England men's captain Harry Kane has told the BBC that seeing the Lionesses win the Euros has given his team even more motivation to win the World Cup. With just 3 weeks to the start of the tournament, Kane has unveiled a mural which depicts him and the Lionesses captain Leah Williamson at a football bar in London.
Brilliant Harry Kane. Yes. Ice cool Harry Kane. England's captain scores again.
You learn as you go on, the more experience you gain in the big situations, the big tournaments. You adapt to it, and you take things from every game that you learn. So of course, I think in any major tournament for England especially, there's always pressure, and it's about just trying to control that. I like to just prepare well. I feel like if I prepare well, the games will take care of themselves, and hopefully that could be the case this winter. Such a great feeling when the Lionesses won and the ladies done it. Gives us even more motivation, inspiration to go and have a successful World Cup. So we know it's going to be difficult for sure. There's a lot of hard work to go and achieve that. But yeah, the whole country's going to be behind us like they were for them, and it's something to be excited about.
And it is in from Harry Kane again.
just crazy to be up there on the wall, and the guy's done a great job, so realistic, and yeah, I think it would be great for young children, especially coming down here to see that, and hopefully give them some inspiration.
Put in by Captain Kane.
A footballer's career is not the longest, and it comes and goes so quick. And I think for me, investing in stuff that I'm passionate about is really important. I just feel like it's a really great place for people to come. For example, the World Cup this winter, come and spend time with your friends, your family, watch it on the big screen together, can play football whilst you're here. You know, football's such a, well, it's the biggest sport worldwide, and to have a place like this you can come with your friends, I think it's really important.
Harry Kane. Let's take a look at the weather now, shall we? Here's Thomas Schaffenacker. Hello.
Hello, Jane. You know, I felt very disoriented this morning when I stepped out of the house. It felt so mild, and, you know, it feels more like September across many parts of the country right now. The weather does tend to change. The rain comes and goes. But as far as the temperatures go, up to 21 degrees in one or two spots across the southeast, and once again 17 in Edinburgh as well, all down to this current of warm air that's spreading in from the south, not just over us, but many parts of Western Europe. In France at the moment, in some spots, temperatures are in the mid, maybe even high 20s in one or two areas. Now, here's that rain that swept across the country earlier on. It's now mostly moved to the north and out into the North Sea. Behind it, what you can't see on the satellite picture is the low grey cloud that's still hanging around in a few areas. So I think we'll call it sort of bright spells rather than sunny spells, I think, for most of us. The exception here is in East Anglia in the southeast, where it is really lovely. So 20, 21 degrees, possibly 22. And in the north of the country in Scotland, a little bit more clouds, some spots of rain, mid, high teens in one or two areas. Now, clear for a time, or clear spells this evening, but as we head through tonight, this heavy rain is going to sweep into western parts of the UK, particularly heavy, I think, for a time in Northern Ireland and also western Scotland. So here, lashings of rain with gusty winds, but further towards the east and the south, the weather should be dry and very mild, of course, overnight, 13, 14, 15 degrees. So wet for a time for many of us, I think, tomorrow morning, but swiftly that weather front moves to the north. It will stick around in northern Scotland into the evening hours. And again, tomorrow, every bit as mild. So we're getting these temperatures of 20 degrees or more multiple days in a row. I talked about that yesterday. That's not going to change into the weekend. So again, the weather's changeable. Weather fronts keep coming in from the south. That's where that warm air is coming from. Wet weather for a time in the morning on Saturday. And I think many of us will get at least some rain, but then it clears up. And again, in the southeast, 20 or 21 degrees Celsius, mid-teens across. Now, these temperatures here, these should be down there this time of the year. Let's take a look at Sunday. Admittedly, a little fresher. 18 is still above the average, around 14 or 15 there for the lowlands of Scotland, but some showers, I think, for northwestern areas through the weekend. Now, it does look as though things will tend to turn a little bit cooler as we go into next week, but from the icons you can see very changeable weather and exceedingly mild, at least into the start of the week. Jane, back to you.
All right, Thomas, thank you very much indeed. And that is the news at 1 for today. On BBC One, we will join our newsrooms wherever you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.